Here's the thing. It's not so much about how long the lead up is in the launch, and it's not about building excitement during that lead up, but rather it is about ensuring that your audience is where they need to be ready to buy when cart opens. Welcome to Imperfect Action. I'm Steph Taylor. For years, I read all the books, downloaded all the freebies, and did all the courses. But it wasn't until I started taking imperfect action that my business had its first $1 million year. Imperfect action is about doing things before you're ready, prioritizing consistent action over perfect action, and moving forward, even when you're not sure you're doing it right. On this show, you can expect mindset advice, actionable marketing tips, and strategies to build a business that brings you more profit, more freedom, and even more joy. Are you on the list to get my daily biz boosters? Every day, I'll send you a bite-sized prompt designed to help you grow your business in a more intentional way. Sign up at stephtaylor.co/DBB or at the link in the show notes. Hey, welcome back to Imperfect Action. This is episode 671. Today is an Ask Steph episode where I'm answering a question that was submitted by a listener. Now, if you have a question that you want to ask me, and that you want me to potentially answer on a future episode of Imperfect Action Podcast, you can submit that at stephtaylor.co/asksteph. You'll find the link to that in the show notes below this episode as well. So today's question is from Morgan. And the question that Morgan submitted is, you mentioned that products should not be made evergreen until you have live launched them a couple of times. You're also really clear that a proper launch requires a big lead up, an appropriate strategy, and a sense of urgency in having cart open and cart closing dates. My question is, if you believe that this is also what is required to live launch a low-ticket offer, such as a $57 workshop or masterclass that doesn't lead to any other big-ticket offer. Do you personally do the same big lift for low-ticket offers in your business? And how might your live launch strategy change when they are low-ticket offers? I love this question so much because I get asked this a lot, especially from people who are launching those offers, that are maybe $50 to $200 that are slightly lower ticket. Now, I want to clarify a couple of things that you mentioned in your question, Morgan. So firstly, the big lead up. You mentioned that I've made it really clear that a launch requires a big lead up. And here's the thing. It's not so much about how long the lead up is in the launch, and it's not about building excitement during that lead up, but rather it is about ensuring that your audience is where they need to be ready to buy when doors open, when cart opens. Now, what do I actually mean by that? So I'm going to use one of my offers as an example. I have the podcast launch plan. That's my $200-ish offer to launch a podcast. And somebody can want to launch a podcast, but they might believe that it's too hard, it's too techy, the equipment's too expensive, so it's not possible for them to launch a podcast. And until they understand that it's actually quite simple and that the equipment is quite affordable, they're not going to buy the podcast launch plan because those things are going to get in the way. Those hesitations are going to get in the way. Now, usually, but not always, smaller offers are going to have, so lower ticket offers are going to have less of a gap between where your ideal client is now and where they need to be ready to buy. This isn't because of the price point. It's usually because the smaller offer is usually solving a smaller problem or a smaller transformation. And there's less of a knowledge gap between where they are now and where they need to be ready to start solving that problem or achieving that transformation. The second part to my answer is where you talk about the urgency. Now, urgency in a launch is a really interesting thing because a lot of people believe that we have the urgency there to pressure somebody into buying in a launch. And it's not actually about pressuring somebody to buy. Humans are procrastinators. Our brains are wired to delay pain, and spending money can feel really painful. And then couple this with the pain of making some kind of behavioral change. So starting to take action on solving whatever problem they're experiencing or achieving the transformation that your offer helps them to achieve. They're going to put off making a decision for as long as they possibly can. So it's not so much about having urgency as it is about having a deadline for somebody to make a decision. it's not about pressuring them to make a decision, but it's more about saying, hey, you need to make a decision either way. And here's a deadline for you to make it so that you don't just keep kicking the can down the road forever. Now, when you are teaching a live workshop, like you mentioned in your question, a $57 workshop, that has natural urgency built in because the workshop is live. So somebody has to buy it before the live workshop happens. Otherwise, they're only going to get the recording. They're going to miss out on that live event. But you can also have other deadlines like bonuses expiring, price increases. Those all make really nice deadlines as well. It doesn't just have to be this doors open, doors closed. You can't ever sign up again after doors are closed, or you have to wait until the next intake, right? Now, there is one exception when it comes to having that deadline, and that is when they are in a really painful situation and your offer delivers some kind of immediate relief. A good friend of mine, Riz from Found Legal, she was also a guest on this show a couple of months ago. She has a copycat kit. So she's a lawyer and she has a copycat kit where if you've been ripped off, if somebody's copied your stuff, the copycat kit delivers that immediate relief. That's a product that somebody's not going to buy during a launch, right? It's something that somebody's going to reach for when they have that problem and it's really painful in that particular moment. That is like the one exception that I would say where you don't need to have some kind of deadline. Okay, then we want to look also at the bigger picture of this launch. Now, we want to think a little bit more about lifetime value rather than just about sales from that one particular launch, because you would have to sell 100 of your $57 workshop to make $5,700 from that launch. And that is fine, right? If you're early on in your business, that's probably going to be a nice chunk of revenue. But I always like to remind my students to keep their expectations quite realistic when it comes to lower ticket offers, because they're not likely to be a huge revenue driver unless you have a large audience. A launch of a lower ticket offer is probably not going to be a massive revenue launch unless you have that huge audience, unless you're getting it in front of all of those eyeballs. So you really need to think about what is next after this offer. I know you mentioned in your question there's no next step, there's no high ticket offer as part of it, but the people who are attending that workshop, they're probably going to finish that workshop wondering, how else can I work with you? What's that next step? So give them a next step. And if there is that next step, then you need to be mindful in your overall launch strategy. So including in that launch for that lower ticket offer, you need to be mindful that you are bridging the gap, the magician's gap, which I call it, that knowledge gap for the next step offer, as well as that lower ticket offer. So that when you present them that next step offer, they're ready to take that next step. They don't have a huge knowledge gap that needs bridging there as well. And another thing to consider as well with lower ticket launches is upsells and order bumps. So that can increase the average order value when somebody's buying. So they're not just spending $57, they might be adding on some extra things to their purchase, which might bring them up to $100 or even potentially more. So the difference between an upsell and an order bump is usually something that's quite low ticket, like, $7, $20, something like that. And they can tick a box at checkout to add that to their order. An upsell is potentially going to be something that's a little bit higher ticket than what they've already purchased. And it's presented to them on a separate sales page or a separate one-pager after they've already completed checkout, and they can still just press one button to add that to their order. So that's how I differentiate between those two. And the last part of your question, you asked how I approach lower ticket launches in my business. Now, we haven't launched a true low ticket, like sub $100 offer in a while. Offer less, sell more is probably the most recent lowish ticket offer that we launched. And the first time that we launched it at the end of 2022, it was a $100 workshop that I taught live. And I didn't do a webinar to launch it. I didn't do a huge fancy launch. I launched it to my email list with a series of cart open emails. I had been doing some podcast content around that topic in the lead up, but I already have a very warm audience. And I knew that this was something they were really struggling with. I know that they already trust me. So it was a pretty easy yes for the people who are on my email list. Then after I taught that live workshop, I recorded it, I turned it into a course, and we've launched it twice this year already with live webinars. And while we haven't really done a massive lead up in those launches, You'll also notice that a lot of my podcast content is bridging the gap between where they are right now and where they need to be ready to buy, offer less, sell more. And also the webinar that I've launched it with has bridged that gap. So a free webinar has bridged that gap between where they are now and where they need to be ready to buy, offer less, sell more. And now we're in the process of turning that evergreen. We've live launched it a couple of times. It's been converted really well. So now we're putting it into an evergreen funnel where somebody can watch that recorded webinar. They can still get bonuses as if it were a live launch, but those bonus deadlines are based on when they watched the webinar. So it's as if it's live, but it still has those real deadlines. They're not fake deadlines. They are real deadlines. So that's a little bit of an insight into the back end of our lower ticket launches. Thank you so much for this question, Morgan. And if any of you have a question, if you're listening to this and you're like, oh, I'd love to hear Steph's opinion on this, or if you have a particular situation that you're like, it's churning around in your head, submit those questions, stephtaylor.co/asksteph, and I will answer it. You can submit them anonymously as well if you don't want to put a name to it. I love reading the questions that are submitted. I also love reading your reviews that you've been leaving in Apple Podcasts. So if you have 30 seconds, leave me a quick review. It means a lot to me because I spend a lot of time creating and recording these episodes, and sometimes I feel like I'm just talking into a microphone. So please do leave those reviews. I read every single one of them. Thank you so much for listening. Catch you next time.